Hi. Okay, good morning. Very nice to see you all again. And so what we're going to do today between now and 1 o'clock is think about the exam for sc364. And so in the first hour I'm going to say a few general remarks, and then we're going to focus on the autumn term in the first hour, 50 minutes, and then in the second 50 minutes the spring term. So if you're doing the autumn term, you can obviously leave halfway through. If you're doing the spring, you don't have to sit through the first bit if you don't want to. So the first thing to say about the exam is that the idea is to test you on the module. So there shouldn't be anything that's a surprise in the question. So it's completely drawn from the lectures, from the readings, so it should be familiar topics. In a minute I'm going to show you the topics that are in the exam, not the questions, because it's an unseen paper, but I'm going to give you an indication of the topics that are going to be in the exam, so you can choose what to revise. There's no point you trying to revise something that's not going to turn up. So I will give you a sort of indication for each question of what the question is going to be broadly about. If you want to find that on the Moodle page, it's in the section under revision slides, autumn term. It says exam topics there, so that's what it looked like. So autumn term, that says autumn under that bit, autumn term, and then spring. So I'll go through those in a bit. If you want to find them later, they're on the autumn term revision slide page. So as I say, the aim is to kind of test you on the module, and there are two things to bear in mind really when you're thinking about how to address the essay questions, which is that there are two sides to the questions really. One is what I'd call the substantive issue. So what is the topic? What's the sort of stuff that you're looking at? And then there's the literature about that topic, the debates about that topic. So when you think about each of the areas you're going to revise, you need to think about what's the substantive issue, what's the phenomenon we're talking about, such as the popular press, and then what have people written about that phenomenon. So you're being asked to both show knowledge of the phenomenon and knowledge of the debates about the phenomenon. So think about it not in terms of your own views on the topic particularly, but what people have written about that topic. So this is where engaging with the readings on the module is very important. So to show your knowledge of the kind of key literature, things you do for the essay, the coursework essay. You know, you're reading what authors have said about the topic. So just bear that general principle in mind. You're being tested on knowledge of the topic itself, the substance of it, and also on what people have said about that topic. So I would begin your preparation by obviously narrowing down the topics you're going to revise, and then once you've done that, go back to your essay notes, to the set readings, to the Moodle slides, and just kind of remind yourself what the kind of key issues are. I'm going to run through some of the lecture slides again for each of the topics, just so you get a sense of the issues again. But so you start big and then you try and narrow it down. So I would try and narrow down your revision so you end up with a kind of 1 or 2 sides of A4 that you're trying to kind of remember and learn. And again, think about key authors, key debates, and so on. So I guess you've all done exams before. Have you done exams before? Yeah. But I'm just going to show you what the paper looks like, so it's not quite so terrifying on the day. So on the Moodle page, down the right-hand side here, you can see past exam papers. So I'm going to look at last year's, full year one. Okay, it'll be different. It has to be different from last year's paper, right? So there's not going to be the same questions. But, so this is a spring one. Hang on, let's come back. Do full year. So, if you're doing the full year version, it's 3 hours, and you have to answer 3 questions in total. And the paper is going to be split into 2 sections. Section A, autumn term. Section B, spring term. So you have to do 1 from the autumn, 1 from the spring, and 1 from either of that. So the really important thing when you get into the exam is to read the instructions. Well, before you do that, the first thing is to get to the exam on the right day. I mean, it sounds really, really basic, but it does happen. People turn up the day after. You really don't want to be doing that. That's like very, very, stressful. And so work out when it is, where it is, get there on time. So once you're there, the first thing when they say turn over the paper is just read the instructions. So the first thing for this paper, of course, is to do what it says. So 1 from section A, 1 from section B. Don't just all answer from section A. Okay, you've got a problem then. So really read the instructions carefully. And the other thing to do is to read the questions really carefully. Because if you don't read them carefully, you're being tested on answering the question, not just writing all you know about the topic. So you've got to focus the material to answer the question. So if it says, like question 3 here, the views of Leavis and Reith differ, you've got to talk about both Leavis and Reith and compare them. Don't just talk about Leavis and forget about Reith. So really fundamental that you answer the question. You get more points for answering the question, more marks than even if it's a slightly shorter answer than if you write everything you know about Leavis that isn't really relevant to the question. So really read the question. I would actually underline bits in the question. So if it says give examples or compare or discuss, or just so you know what the question's about. And sometimes the question might appear to be about one thing, but it might be about more than that. So really think about what the question is saying and read it carefully and just take a few minutes to understand the question. Because the temptation is to kind of leap in and go, all right, this is a question about the BBC and I'm going to write. And you need just to really just stop yourself from kind of leaping in too quickly. People do exams in different ways. One technique is to write a plan for each of your questions at the beginning. Just a basic plan, like these are the things I'm going to cover. These are the key authors. The advantage of that is you've sort of got a lot of information down at the beginning of the exam and then you're not going to forget it. And the second thing is if you don't finish all the questions and you've got these plans at the beginning, the marker will look at those plans and give you credit for what's in even if you've not finished the third essay. So, I mean, you do it how you wish, but I would always recommend having a plan. It's a way of getting information down so it's there, and then you can slightly relax, and then you go and write them as essays. But, it's an individual thing, really. The other thing is, if you're doing the full year and you're doing 3 essays, 3 answers, you need to divide your time up so that you're giving roughly the same amount of time to each question. It's no good spending 2 hours on the first question, maybe like 90% essay, and then you run out of time. So try and make sure you give each question about the same amount of time. It's easier to get a higher mark with three essays than it is with two that are brilliant and one that's not finished. So plan your time in that sense. And I'd also say reread your answers if you've got the time. Make sure they make sense, because someone has to read your answers and mark them. And, it helps just to check there's not massive kind of mistakes or missing words or, general confusion. It's easy to do when you're writing, So try and reread them. Also try and write as clearly as you can. So again, some poor bugger's got to read these. And, you want to make the marker feel well disposed towards you. You don't want them to go, Christ, what the hell is that? And then be a bit grumpy and, not feel very well disposed towards you. So try and write legibly and clearly, and try and make sure it kind of makes sense. And just check any final check. So, if you give yourself a bit of time at the end just to go through, that will be very good, I think. Final thing is to remember is what it says on the back of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Don't panic. Don't panic when you see the questions. Don't panic in the exam. Just try and remember what you've learned and engage with during the module. There's nothing in there that you've not covered on the module, so it shouldn't be a surprise. So as I say, it's an unseen exam, so you won't know the questions until you turn the paper over. But they're going to look like this. Okay. Now, in terms of the particular topics, as I say, we go into the autumn slides section. So to give you a bit of direction and to stop you revising things that don't come up, I'm going to give you a kind of steer about what the topics are in the paper. So for the autumn term, you'll have to write, there'll be a choice of 5 questions, and they will cover, in some way or in some form, popular press, photography, leisure and recreation, the BBC and broadcasting, critics and mass culture. So some permutation on those themes are going to be in the autumn term questions. So you know if you revise one or more of those topics, there will be a question that in some way addresses that. How it's going to ask you, you obviously have to work out on the day. So that's for the autumn term, and then for the spring, similarly, there'll be 5 questions that in some permutation will cover the questions around sexuality, Americanization, affluence and class, TV and race, heritage culture. Now, the important thing to say about these topics is that it's worth thinking about the connections between topics as well. So, obviously, say something like, I'll come to this in a minute, but TV and race, that might mean thinking about television in general as well. So there's a broader question we looked at about the transition from a radio-centred to a television-centred culture, how TV becomes the most important form of entertainment and information by the 60s. So there's a kind of broader, this is not just the one lecture on this particular topic. It might be that you can draw upon more than one lecture. So that think about the connections between the topic and other themes on the module. Don't bring everything into every question, but if it's relevant, think about the connections. So connections are important as well as focusing on the question at hand. So after this lecture, you can go, when you think about revision, you can be sure that in some form or another, these are the topics that are going to be in the exam. I mean, how they're going to look is going to be different, but if you revise these areas, you know that you're on safe ground. So let's just remind ourselves of what we talked about in relation to those topics. So I'm going to run through really quickly to remind you. So, popular press. So I think the key things to think about, again, are some of the key authors to look at. So if you're interested in writing about the popular press, it's what are the different interpretations that have been made of what was new about the new journalism. So one place to start is Raymond Williams' arguments, where he has a particular account of what lay behind the growth of the new journalism. So you need to think about what Williams is saying. And then there's a broader argument about print culture from the 18th century onwards, where you have this struggle to create a free press, a free commercial press. And you can touch a bit on the kind of struggles around the freeing of the press, but then you're into, I suppose, the question of what was new about the new journalism. So what made the new popular newspapers distinctive? And the way to think about that is in part thinking about the Daily Mail, which we looked at. So there's a kind of broader history to think about: the struggle to free the press, the suppression of the old popular radical press, and the way the commercial press was the beneficiary of this commercialization and freeing of the press, and how this lays the ground for the kind of modern mass circulation daily newspaper. So it's an advertising-led process. There's a broader kind of growth of print culture and literacy in this period through things like these popular fiction. But yeah, I suppose a lot of the questions about the new journalism and what made it new, how it drew upon earlier forms of like the Sunday newspapers, and what, I suppose the question is, what was news? How it redefined news. News as human interest, entertainment, opinion, and whether this was a format that also was quite importantly targeted at women. So the Daily Mail becomes a paper which, for its critics, is like a kind of, like a department store advertising pamphlet. So there's an issue about gender, about the content of the new journalism, the struggle around print culture, and the different interpretations of that. So, I mean, look back through the slides, gives you a kind of basic framework, and then obviously look at the reading you've done that would underpin that. So, popular press is going to be something around that. I suppose popular press also, in terms of like thinking about that thing of connections, popular press is also partly bound up with the issue of leisure and recreation. It's part of that broader commercialization of leisure, from the 19th century, where it sits alongside, you've got popular newspapers, cinema, seaside holidays, radio. I mean, there's that broader kind of reshaping of recreation, and I suppose reading a paper is in part a recreational activity. So you could touch on that broader theme. Okay, leisure, photography, I'll come back to that. Well, let's do leisure and actually next. So leisure is quite a big topic, as I've just indicated. You can go in different directions with it. Again, same with the popular press. There's a sort of debate about this struggle over popular recreations going on in the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society, and how new ideas of leisure are being developed, where leisure is being defined more clearly against something called work. So work and free time are new ideas that develop in that transition from agrarian to an industrial society. And that this new idea of free time is something that commercial providers increasingly provide leisure in your free time. So you've got this shift from agrarian ideas of leisure, which are much blurrier. There's not such a strong division between work and recreation. And people sometimes make their own leisure, to a system where people become consumers of leisure that's being produced for them by a culture industry. So there's a kind of history to refer to there. And there's also, I suppose, if you know, this is issues some of the essays people wrote on this topic, is there's a kind of key text, I suppose, Clark and Critcher, which is these sort of 6 key aspects of the broad transformation in leisure. So if I was you, I would talk about Clark and Critcher, because it's key to this. It gets you into these key kind of elements. So what is driving the new forms of recreation and leisure are changes in the working day, so giving workers more free time, extension of middle class ideas of leisure, so the middle class think leisure is important sort of morally for your well-being, so that becomes part of why leisure is worth investing in. The local state provides both provides leisure and regulates leisure through licensing. And then the key thing is commercialisation, the rise of a leisure industry, and then work. So Clark and Critcher is quite a good framing of this issue about what are the big factors bound up in this process. And you could look at those then in relation to things like the rise of music hall, the rise of cinema, popular newspaper, but also we did it in terms of the seaside holiday as an example of these new forms of commercial leisure. So Blackpool's obviously the kind of classic example of this process of the creation of a kind of commercial industry around leisure for a mass working class audience, and the town itself is transformed by that process from being a kind of rather posh elite site of leisure to becoming, you know, a kind of mass entertainment phenomenon. So there's kind of a lot of detail in that in terms of how Blackpool changes, but also you could use that. You could answer that same question by looking at cinema as well as the seaside holiday. Okay, so photography is, again, it's quite a broad topic. So I think two big sort of pillars of this topic. One is the technology of photography, how it develops, who are the key pioneers of photography, from Fox Talbot in England to Louis Daguerre in France. And thinking about the arguments of people like John Tagg about why did photography take off? Why was there a demand for this new kind of form of representation? And so Tagg links it to broader social shifts with an emerging middle class who want a kind of cheap form of portraiture. And then in a way they're mimicking the aristocracy who have their portraits painted, and that's very expensive. So photography is a way of giving a new emerging middle class market cheap forms of portraiture, and that for Tagg is what drives the demand for photography. So it begins really as a cheap alternative to the oil painting as a form of portraiture. And it's very much linked with these deeper social changes and an emerging middle class. But then it becomes democratized further. So it goes from being a middle class process to becoming very widespread in the culture. So photography begins to become the way in which images circulate everywhere in the culture because they're cheaper to mass reproduce with photography. So images appear in newspapers, in publicity and advertising. You get this kind of democratization of access to looking at images. And you can think about that theoretically in terms of Benjamin's work on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. Talk about Benjamin. And then the second strand is a way, so this is about democratization of access to looking at images. The second part is about democratization of creating images. And what marks that shift is the invention of the cheap, mass-produced camera. This is the story of Kodak and the box brownie, and the way this gives ordinary people the ability for the first time to represent themselves to themselves, to represent their own lives visually. And there's a whole discussion about photography and leisure, so taking pictures at the seaside, taking pictures of you out having a nice time, but also how that gets turned inwards into domesticity and domestic life. People using the camera to document family life, children, and so on. And how that process of self-representation is partly shaped by wider public norms about families and how you represent families. So there's a kind of set of tacit assumptions about what a family is that I think people internalise. Anyway, so that you've got these two big dimensions you need to think about for answering the question on photography. To say, I mean, there's the big kind of theoretical argument is Walter Benjamin, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, the shift from image making being really a religious practice tied to kind of the church, to becoming a secular commercial practice in which things are designed to circulate. So you go from what Benjamin calls, you know, the shift from ritual to exhibition. So ritual is images in the kind of religious process, pretty static. Photography allows images to move around, to be exhibited, to circulate. And that's the big shift he's talking about. And then you can start to sort of, there's new politics of image making in the process. So it's quite a lot of good slides on that particular PowerPoint that you can think about, I guess. But make sure you bring in some kind of key authors. It's not just about the substantive issue, it's also about the literature. Final point, of course, is we talked a lot about photography and domesticity, photography and leisure, but there's another kind of archive or another social practice which uses photography, and that's around surveillance. So the use of photography in prisons and asylums as a way of documenting criminality and insanity, the way the prison photograph and the asylum photograph individualize the signs of criminality or madness in the individual through the portrait. These are portraits you don't want taken. They're about social control. So you can touch on that issue as well, the other dimension of photography. There's no direct question on cinema, but as I say, if you've written about cinema in your essay, you want to bring it in, you can bring it in the question on leisure. But don't kind of rock up thinking I'm going to write about a whole essay on cinema, because it's likely not to be one in the exam. So it's to say relevant to leisure and recreation. The final topic is around, the penultimate topic is around the BBC. So I think we did sort of three sessions on the BBC. First really important one is around public service broadcasting. So the history of radio in Britain as a new form of mass communication is sort of unthinkable without the way the BBC shapes that technology socially through the ideas of public service broadcasting. And so you need to understand what public service broadcasting is, how did Reed think about it, what were the kind of key principles, why was it developed, what is a public service, how is it different from a kind of commercial broadcasting system? Why did Britain choose a public corporation rather than a free market commercial system? What was the role of America in that process? So, the idea of public service broadcasting is really fundamental, I think, I can't remember what the question says, but I mean, that's really important, I think. And as a way of discussing that, I think there were I talked about these two pillars of public service broadcasting, which were to do with cultural enlightenment, so raising cultural standards, and then secondly, helping to shape an informed democracy. The BBC and mass democracy are born at the same time, really, mid-1920s. So there's something about the role of broadcasting in an age of mass democracy that's very important to understand. And then also the way in which, how the BBC thinks about its role as a broadcaster in a modern democracy is how it tries to integrate people into a shared national culture. So the way in which, it says here, the BBC seeks to strengthen the horizontal bonds of national belonging. In other words, people feel themselves part of a national community through listening in, and they feel, therefore, they belong to something bigger than themselves. They're integrated into this new national culture. So you can give examples of that. I think we looked at sporting events, music, as part of this idea of creating a shared national culture and this new shared experience of the public sphere in the home. That idea then of the audience of the BBC are not individuals but households and families listening in. So it's not like the cinema audience, which is really an anonymous kind of audience turning up of individuals. This is conception of the audience as families listening in. The family audience is the core audience, and therefore they're part of the wider family of the nation, and then through the Empire Service, this idea of the family of Britain's partner nations. So there's a kind of familial idea that runs through that early period of public service broadcasting. And the radio is tying people into a shared national culture. It's also trying to integrate people into a shared imperial culture. I mean, there's obviously a question we looked at about whether there are hierarchies within that imperial culture, with the mother country at the centre and the colonies at the periphery, and sort of certain assumptions about who was really fully British, but nonetheless, there's some attempt to create this family of nations through the airwaves. And you get more radical voices in the BBC through things like Caribbean Voices, bringing the kind of voice of colonial subjects into the BBC, bringing a more sort of diverse representation of empire. That's just red on the map. Okay. The other thing in the BBC is you can then obviously talk about how the BBC changes during the Second World War. I'm not going to go through this in quite so much detail, but public service broadcasting doesn't stay the same. And I suppose one of the things that people would argue would define it in the 1930s, it's the BBC telling people what's good for them. You've got to listen to classical music and brainy stuff because it's supposed to be about cultural uplift. what the Second World War does is it makes the BBC soften that idea and make it more catering to popular tastes. So the war, the BBC has a very good war in the sense it comes out with a very enhanced authority, but it also is changed by the war because it recognises it has to give the listener a bit more of what it's interested in, so more popular music, American music, more comedy. So it's a kind of process of change, and I think after the war the BBC has this stronger notion of different audiences. And that's represented, I suppose, in the holy trinity of BBC Radio after the war, which is the Home Service, the Light Programme, and the Third Programme, and those are a hierarchy of the sort of the Light Programme is all the popular stuff at the bottom, and then there's the Home Services to the middle bit, and then right at the top of the pyramid is the Third Programme. And you're supposed to kind of move through that process. So it's both recognising more different audience tastes, but also trying to hold some notion that you should kind of move through those different listening experiences. And the final aspect we looked at was the way radio broadcasting was very important in terms of shaping the experience of time, temporality of radio. So this is engaging in Paddy Scannell's work, but these three big dimensions of the way you can think about the temporality of broadcasting for Scannell, which is its eventfulness. It creates a sense of event. It helps to structure the year, and also structures the idea of daily time and dailiness. It's a daily service, and you can work through some of that in terms of these broader, deeper structures. I think what Scannell's trying to explain is how broadcasting becomes this enduring structure in people's lives through which they organise their daily lives. So you have a sense of the day and the week and the year that's increasingly structured in relation to broadcasting. And that, in a deeper sense, creates a sense of security for people. This idea of ontological security, that the world has a familiar and recurring structure. And broadcasting for Scannell, I think, why it's so powerful as a social technology is it gives those structures. So again, have a look through the slides. And then the final topic for the autumn takes us back to the beginning, really, which is the critics of mass culture. So one of the things that the module is trying to get you to think about is that these massive changes that come with the emergence of the mass media and mass culture from the late 19th century through the first half of the 20th century, that those changes that the module describes were subject to intense debate about whether they're good, bad, whether this is the end of the world or bright new future. So from the 1920s, critics are trying to make sense of the social transformation being brought by mass culture and the new mass communication, or what they call, what Leavis calls machine civilization. And we obviously looked really principally at two authors in that, or two mainly, Leavis and Priestley. So the question on the critics of mass culture will include one or other of those writers, and you can bring both into answering the question. This is a good point where thinking about the question is very important. The question might just say, well, I think as last year's did, it said Leavis and Reith. That's forcing you to think across not just this topic, but the BBC as well. But you could talk about Precy and answering that question. Precy's not in the question, but you can bring him in. So think about what the question's saying and what the broader debates are. So Leibis and Precy are very good examples of critical responses to mass culture. So it's things like levelling down and this anti-Americanism of Leibis and to some extent Precy. We can also look at Orwell as well. His kind of antipathy towards American pulp fiction as an embodiment of the new kinds of mass communication. So you can bring in that. So it's again, what are their arguments? What are they saying? What's going on in the world that they're responding to? So you need to describe the substantive developments and the critical debates. Now that's obviously, these are just kind of sort of bullet points I've been talking through. You need to obviously expand on them and write it out as an essay and link the different bits together. But I think if you think along these lines, you need to cover these. These are the things you need to cover. But make sure you sort of turn them to what the question's asking. And don't just go, oh, Leibis. Everything I know about Leibis. Because it won't. You'll get some credit for that, but it won't be top marks. Are there any sort of questions about then the autumn term and the exams in general? Get a sense of what you need to do. And see. Will that make sense? Nothing surprising in that? You think, good grief, we didn't know we did that. Yeah, have a look at the Moodle slides. They're a really good place to start. And then look at the readings, your notes. If you've done an essay on the topic, that's really helpful, obviously. Don't just reproduce the same essay, obviously. You need to make it fit the question. Does anyone here write out their answers before they go in? No one write out a sort of essay and then try and... That's good. So any questions, observations? Make sense? Familiar? Obviously, you can take a certain amount into the exam. You can take your notes and notes in. You can take books in up to a point. Don't come into the exam with like 25 books. But you can take your notes in, so that helps quite a lot. You can't take your phones in though. You can't use online access in the exam. You can't get the phone translating for you. So don't get caught out. No, all clear. No questions. Okay, all right. We'll have a little break, if you like, a 5-minute break. And then we'll talk about the spring term. Everyone's asking now? Okay, I can see you later on today. Yes. 2:30.
I mean, because I wasn't here for the class about it. It sounds really interesting, but it's like I said, it's like it's like one more than five. Don't we have another lesson next week? But that's fine. No, next okay, it's on next Thursday. That's why he's doing it. Every Thursday. Great. Five boys. Yeah. Because for me, it feels like, I was so confused. It was like, is it a being split? I mean, it would have been nice having this whole. That was like, yeah. What is it? I feel like I got the email. I don't even know what I got. And then you literally just go on vacation. I mean, it's just like my entirety of me. I'm jealous. So you get it all out of Did you this one is a compulsory. That makes sense why this is. So it's like, okay, I have some here and some here. It feels okay right now. I'll forget my word now. Yeah. In my head, the exam is on the or is it not?
Yes. You do one from the autumn, one from the spring, and then one from May. Yes. You just have to write 3 from the list.
Oh wait, yeah. This one. This one. It's a 2. It's a 2. And a 5. Why is it? I'd rather culture myself in the body and
When is the exam? Is it
it's in May, the 13th. The 13th from 2 to 5. It's really horrible. I'd rather have it in the morning, so like my morning is like, okay, exam. Afterward, I have my freedom to myself in the afternoon.
There are more fun ways to spend 3 hours, I guess. Okay, I'm going to talk about the spring term topics. So, just to remind you, there you have a choice of 5 questions on the spring term curriculum, and it will include some variation on those themes. So let's kind of think about what that might mean. Okay, so sexuality. I think that sexuality does quite a lot of different things. I suppose there's an overarching theme, which is, I suppose, broadly this argument about sometimes called kind of permissiveness or liberalization, or but the shift from a more repressive culture to a more hedonistic culture in which people are kind of freer in their sexual choices and displays of sexuality in public. There's this broader sort of shift going on, a kind of loosening of kind of moral codes from a kind of very restricted culture, lots of shame around sex and very sort of negative ideas, to slightly more relaxed kind of view. So that's the sort of deeper shift, which they sometimes call permissiveness or liberalization, or what Martin Francis calls a shift from a culture of self-discipline to a culture of self-expression and hedonism. Now that transition, though, is not straightforward. It's not just a kind of upwards curve of kind of liberation. It's rather uneven transition because of the complicated ways in which sexual life and private life get bound up with politics in this period. The first thing that's driving this interest in sexuality and private life is about the role of the state, really, particularly in relation to birth rates and families and the need to kind of encourage family planning, but also increase the birth rate. And so that interest in promoting a sort of conservative view of the family in the 50s with a sort of full-time wife and mother, husband, and then 2.4 kids and a dog, that is really important it's both written into the kind of welfare state, how the welfare state thinks about family life, how benefits work. Classically, married women can't claim certain benefits because they're deemed to be dependent on their husbands. There are still some occupations with things like marriage bars in place into the 1960s. So if a woman gets married, she has to leave that job. So there's kind of quite a sort of conservative view of family life written into state policy. And what that also then brings attention to is, so if a lot of that is about what you would call normative ideas of heterosexual marriage, that focus on that brings irregular sexualities into the spotlight, those who don't fit into those social norms. And there becomes a sort of obsession with these two sexual types in the 40s, 50s and 60s, which is a focus on the threats to social order posed by male homosexuals and also female prostitutes. Both are seen as dangerous sexualities that are disruptive of the sexual order and need to be policed and controlled. And that sets a kind of debate going about how should you best regulate private behaviour. And I suppose although a lot of the impulse is quite negative in a way, this sort of quite negative view of these dangerous sexualities, these dangerous sexual types, in reflecting on how you regulate private life, you get this sort of shift towards a more liberal view. And I suppose that is embedded in particular in the Wolfenden's recommendations on which deal with male homosexuality and female prostitution. And they draw this important new distinction between private life, which should be outside the criminal law, broadly. So you shouldn't be sent to prison for what you do in private, as long as it's based on consenting behaviour between adults. But public displays of irregular sexuality are still kind of punished. So it draws a new line between private and public life. So out of that you get, for example, one of the things that is an issue in terms of female prostitution, street prostitution, is this idea that it was a kind of public sign of what's called vice. So vice is, dangerous, disorderly kinds of sexuality that threaten the social order. So, prostitutes threaten marriages because married men see them and it can undermine their marital harmony. So these are dangerous women, and their danger has to be removed from visibility and has to be made private. And you get this privatization of prostitution that really Wolfenden recommends, where you get prostitution moving from, street corners into kind of the commercial sex industry. So the place like Raymer's Review Bar in Soho, this is a kind of privatization of prostitution, really. So you can now, by becoming a member of these clubs, private member, you can then access sexually explicit displays, so topless dancing, etc. Also, you could meet call girls, prostitutes. So it's sort of, it's taken out of the public domain in a way, it's privatised, but it's then permitted. And it's I think, a part of a broader process that leads to an increasing sexualisation of the culture. So advertising starts to use more explicit imagery, films start using more explicit imagery in terms of nudity. This is mainly female nudity. And so you get this redrawing of the lines between public and private. And it's sort of in the process of sort of relaxation. So these things become sort of permitted as long as they're in certain social spaces. So privatisation is one aspect through street prostitution. The other is around male homosexuality. That issue of the kind of issue, the police in particular and the Home Office are sort of minorly obsessed with the danger of male homosexuality in the 50s. They see it as these are really dangerous kind of men, and they need to be kept out of sight and, policed heavily. And so although the laws that are regulating male homosexual behaviour are very long-standing, they go back to the Victorian periods, they hadn't been heavily enforced in the 1920s, 30s and 40s. But in the 50s, there's this rise in prosecutions. The police are actively seeking to kind of, catch men doing these offences and so on, various kinds of offences, acts of gross indecency and so on. And so it becomes a really high-profile case. And then, as I said before, many a certain number of famous people get caught up in this policing and arrested and so on. One of which is Peter Wildeblood, the Daily Mail's diplomatic correspondent. So the Montague case is quite important because it's a symptom of this increasing policing of male homosexuality, but it's also a point where there's a pushback against that. And Wildeblood is part of this kind of movement to get the law out of private life. And he develops a particularly strong case about liberal reform, particularly in this notion of respectable homosexuals who are not a threat to social order, and they should be not harassed. Still has a notion in Wildeblood that what he calls the what's his phrase? Essentially, the kind of dangerous predatory homosexual or the pervert should be policed, but not the kind of respectful homosexual who sort of passes as a married man most of the time. So you get this interesting debate about who should be protected from the law and who shouldn't. But underlying that then is the sort of, it leads to law reform in the 1960s with the Sexual Offences Act, which partially decriminalises homosexual acts between men aged over 21 in private. Obviously that's subsequently been changed to 16. So there's a kind of equalisation of the law now in place. Profumo is interesting because it's then about the limitations of Wolfenden, really, that it's actually quite difficult to draw a very hard line between private life and public life, because sexuality has this problem that it tends to transgress that division very easily. So Profumo can't keep these things separate. His private life bleeds into his public life, and that shows the kind of limitations, I guess, of Wolfenden, but also this massive fascination in the press with the sort of sleazy details of private life, and that becomes a really important theme in tabloid journalism. Selling sex to its readers as a kind of entertainment. So it's quite a lot you could, depending on what the question asks you, quite a lot of themes to kind of cover, I think, in that one. Oops, come back. Sorry, I managed to lose my... No? Where's it gone? Okay, next theme is around Americanization. So Americanization is actually a theme that goes right across the module, really. I think for the spring term, it's particularly around young people and music and style and the American influence. I suppose there are these two sessions, topic 15 and topic 17 really are both about that question. For many critics, particularly figures like Richard Hoggart, Americanization is a real problem of post-war popular culture. And this, in a way, reawakens debates that have been going on since the 1930s from people like Lewis and Orwell. But even more so because after the Second World War, America's cultural influence is even greater in Europe. So American music, American fashion, American toys, American food becomes very widespread. And America becomes in many ways the standard by which Europeans judge their ways of life. And lots of Europeans, in some senses, are very taken by American culture. It seems to be Americans have better cars, better music, better clothes, better chewing gum, better teeth, better hair, So there's a kind of big pull, but there's also a lot of anxiety. So critics like Hoggart, worry about this. They worry about American popular culture undermining working class British identities. And, the use of literacy compares working class life before Americanization as very positive, and then after Americanization, particularly in the figures of the Jukebox Boys, as really kind of, being eroded and losing its kind of quality and being made trivial and superficial and so on. So the kind of worry, there's a paradox in this period. There's both critics worry about Americanization, what it's doing to British identity, and yet a lot of British people, particularly young working class people, are very drawn to American culture. So there's a kind of different ways of reading this, to critics versus young people. And so you can bring in both perspectives depending on what the question is asking you. And then the examples of the ways in which British youth are drawn to American music is part of this question around youth culture, I guess. In order to understand why young people are drawn to American culture, you need to understand what's happening to young people in general in this period, and this is where you get into the demographic argument. So, there's a lot more young people, a lot more teenagers in the 50s and early 60s. Their education enables them to sort of extend the period from childhood to adulthood. Becomes a bigger space for kind of youthful self-expression and experimentation, and they have more money because the economy is changing. And they become a very important market then for consumer goods of a certain kind, and their money gives them, they're interested in music, sweets, coffee, fashion, magazines, and that's what draws them into the kind of American culture. So I think there's sort of social changes affecting the experience of being young that push them into this new relationship with American culture. The question is, I suppose, why are they drawn to American culture? And I suppose partly it's about imagery and style. So I think Britain is experienced as a kind of grey, drab country. And America looks bright, shiny and new. And the fashions look better and the music is better. So there's a kind of, America is a very alluring form of modernity. compared to kind of dreary, boring old Britain. And it seems to be a kind of freer country to many working class British youth. So it doesn't seem to be as this idea of, it seems to be more classless society, land of opportunity and the American dream. All those ideas, I think, are part of the appeal of America. But also America is not one thing. In America, there are different Americas. So there's sort of white America, white star, but there's also black America that's very important to British youth. And both the sonic landscape of black America, in terms of particularly from blues through to soul music, through gospel in this period, is very appealing. There's also other kinds of cultural influences coming in through music and style. So it's not just America, it's also the Caribbean, through distinctive Caribbean forms of music like ska and then reggae that move into the UK and are taken up by British youth because they like the sounds and they like the iconography, the imagery. And then there's also Europe. European style as well, French and Italian. So there are different kinds of modernities that are appealing. And I think British youth are negotiating their relationship to British culture by drawing upon other places and inventing a kind of slightly different version of Britishness that owes something to European or American or Caribbean style. So it's changing British culture, I think, in quite important ways through this encounter with other cultures. So, Americanization is both these two big dimensions: the critics' view of it and why they worry about Americanization, and then the appeal of America to particularly working class youth, and the different dimensions of that are worth exploring. Now, talked about young people's new kind of economic power in the 50s and 60s. And this is part really of a broader social change, which is to do with what's sometimes called affluence. This is growing prosperity in the 50s and 60s. So, ordinary people have, for the first time, a lot more money in their pockets to spend on their houses, cars, food, etc., etc. And so young people are spending it on, clothing, music, going to coffee bars, cigarettes, sweets, magazines. But their parents are also engaging in new kinds of consumption by investing in their houses, having motor cars, going out to eat. So this is a debate about what does expanding levels of consumption do to social identities. And one of the ways that's thought about quite a lot is what does it mean for class? Because some of the older understandings of social class rested on the fact that working people had less money, did not own their own houses typically, didn't have motor cars, didn't go out to eat as much, and that begins to change in the post-war period through affluence. And people then say, well, does this mean that they're becoming middle class? Because they've got patterns of consumption that look like middle class ways of life. They have their own home, they've got motor cars, they are going out to eat and so on and so forth. So the debate is about how is is affluence eroding class differences? Is Britain becoming a mass middle-class society? Has class disappeared? Are these new kinds of workers now, are these affluent workers who are different from workers of the 1930s? People talked about bourgeoisement, becoming bourgeoisie, becoming middle class. And there's a whole debate, which is particularly in the readings, with David Lockwood's work and Mark Abrams, about whether that's true, really. Was class disappearing? And Lockwood in particular has a kind of quite nuanced argument about how, particularly in their orientations to work, there's still very big class differences. And class persists and class inequalities persist even if there are shifts in the lifestyles of working people. That doesn't mean that it's now a kind of classless society, or they somehow become middle class. I think what's also driving that is a debate about politics, because the Labour Party, which is the traditional party of working people, loses 3 elections in the 1950s and 1960s. And people wondered whether workers were now voting Conservative because they thought of themselves as middle class, because they owned their own homes and had a car and so on, and had more money. So that's what I think drives the debate, are changing voting patterns an indication of something deeper going on in class cultures? And that's what Lockwood's book on the affluent worker is really trying to explain as well. So, what were the kind of, especially to talk about what was affluence, what was happening in consumption patterns, and then the debate about class. So there are two different things to think about. Now, one of the topics that we spend a lot of time on in the spring term is television. And essentially trying to understand the rise of television. Why did the culture go from a culture dominated by radio? Radio is the great mass medium of the 1930s and 40s, to becoming a culture centred around the telly, and the way the television becomes the most important form of mass media by the early 60s. So there's a story about the rise of television and the shift from a radio-centred to a TV-centred home, and looked a bit about how people find a place for TV in their homes and the whole debate about where to put the television, all that sort of stuff. But also how television offered new kinds of popular entertainment like soap operas and other kinds of shows that were very appealing to the audience and shifted them from radio. But television is not a kind of, unproblematic cultural space in this period. And one of the ways in which it is quite problematic is in relation to representations of race and ethnicity. And so one sub-theme is around, TV is very important, but a lot of to some extent, a lot of what's on television is reproducing racist ideas. And this is particularly important in a period when there is this post-war wave of migration into Britain from the former British colonies in the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent. So you've got a social change happening. So Britain is starting to change in terms of its mix of ethnicity and race and religion. I mean, quite small-scale migration, really. I mean, migrants from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent only amount to about 10% of the population. and there are quite heavy restrictions by the 1960s on who can enter Britain. It goes really from relatively open access in 1948 to kind of immigration being sort of choked off by the late 60s. But nonetheless, Britain starts to look a different country, certainly in urban centres, London, Birmingham, etc. And the question is, how does television represent that new feature of British society, these new kind of British subjects? And as you'll see, I mean, it doesn't really cover itself in glory early on, because it tends to define immigration as a social problem, and worse than that, popular entertainment shows reproduced and popularized very extreme forms of popular racism. So particularly situation comedies. I mean, race becomes the focus of humour, and a lot of those shows, things like To Death Us Do Part, really sort of legitimate quite extreme forms of racism. So there's a whole issue about why television, is sort of addressing these new features of post-war social change by really going back to some quite old stereotypes. Nonetheless, that provokes kind of resistance. So people push back at saying these are not on. These are kind of racist ideas that are being legitimated. So you'll see on the Moodle page there's this quite famous BBC Open Door programme called It Ain't Half Racist, Mum, which is from the campaign against racism in the media, and that's sort of trying to say that the BBC and ITV need to change how they think about minority audiences. And that then leads to a campaign for more kind of inclusive representation on television, which I suppose comes to a head with Channel 4 and the remit for Channel 4 in 1982, which is designed to provide programmes for a range of minority audiences and to try and overcome that problem of discriminatory representation. So TV is a really important site for this conflict over the changing nature of British society on the back of post-war migration and how you represent this new diversity of Britain. And that's, becomes a kind of key focus for that. I think made more important by, various social protests, which are not just about broadcasting, but also about policing policy against black and minority populations. So very, very extreme racist policing, particularly in London, that causes kind of riots and so on. So there's a kind of, by the time you get to the early 80s, there's a notion that something needs to change both in policing and on television to make Britain kind of a more inclusive and diverse society that isn't quite so disfigured by institutional racism. So you've got TV, the general story about TV, but then a specific story about television and how it represents minority groups in this period. So it's quite a big topic, and there's quite a lot on the middle page. There's lots of nice films, I think, which are worth looking at with some great examples. So black and white and colour's got brilliant examples you can bring in. Windrush documentary. Obviously, this isn't. I'm not saying this is this has been resolved satisfactorily. I mean, you've got ongoing problems in relation to the Windrush generation, which are still kind of live issues, and a kind of return to anti-immigrant sentiment in the culture. So, kind of quite a rich story. And then the final theme is to do with heritage culture. I think quite a few people wrote this essay. It's quite a nice sort of set piece essay, I suppose. Again, there are two dimensions really. What is heritage culture as a phenomenon? How do you describe what it? Tell me what it is. Describe it. All the different dimensions. You know, from historic buildings to reenactment societies to retro fashions to period television dramas. So what is heritage culture is central to answering that sort of question. And then the second bit is the debate about heritage culture. So is it good or bad? How are you supposed to evaluate it? Is it kind of a sign of a kind of, morbid and sanitized celebration of the past, a sort of symptom of Britain in decline that can't face the future, it gets stuck in its romanticized vision of the past, it's very kind of, symptom of a kind of culture with a kind of loss of faith in the future? Or is it really, should you celebrate this sort of interest in the historical past and so on? So there are key authors in that debate which you need to, so you obviously, one person you need to really talk about, Raphael Samuel, his defense of heritage culture, but also some of the critics, so particularly Patrick Wright. So it's kind of a good example of that general point. What is the substance of this stuff? What are we talking about? What is it as a phenomenon, as an object? And then how do you evaluate it? What are the kind of different debates about it that critics? So you've got defenders of heritage culture and then you've got critics. So you need to have both those dimensions. Give examples and cite key texts. I'm just trying to see what these revision slides actually show. Yeah, so there are these slides. I mean, they're not comprehensive, but you could have a look at those as well. They just go through, they sort of go through the module in a very sort of edited form. So again, you're going to have to, if you're doing the full year, you do one from autumn, one from spring, and then one from either. Anyone just doing the spring term? Yeah, so you just have to do 2 questions in 2 hours from only the spring term. You'll get a different paper with just the spring term on. 2 from 5. 2 from 5? Can't count. 2 from 5. So, any final thoughts, questions? Was that your hand up?
How long do they have to be?
Oh, yeah, good question. Yeah. I would say when they were done online, we used to say 750 words per question, roughly, which is about, what's that, about 3 sides of a booklet, 3 or 4 sides. Depends on your handwriting. Some people write on alternate lines, some people have got massive handwriting, and it's like, I'd say if you're writing more than 10 pages, you probably should stop. It depends, but you can. Some people are very succinct. They can write quite short answers, and they get everything in. And some people take a bit longer to get to the point. So, I'd say 3 to 4 sides. I mean, more than if it's just on 2 sides, I'd be a bit worried. You're not really getting to grips with it. So, 3, 4 sides, up to 5 sides. Start getting towards 10, I'd stop writing. That's the rough idea. Try and make each answer sort of similar weighting. Don't have one amazingly good answer and then 2 that are not very good, if you can help it. But yes, good question about length. Yeah. people sometimes ask about quotes, quotations. Don't need them. If you've got a very good short quote that you can remember and you know where it comes from, you can use it. But make sure you get it right. It's better to not have a quote at all and put a quote in that's wrong. That doesn't look great. And don't feel you've got to memorise great passages of text and quote them. You can, but citing authors is important, even if you're summarising their work. Just so you need to. I want to see kind of authors in the essay, not just your sort of description of the phenomenon, because it's about the debates as much as the things themselves. Yeah, I make it as readable as possible. Otherwise, I mean, sometimes people get called in to read out their exam paper to the marker because no one can decipher the hieroglyphics on the page. You really don't want to be doing that in June or May. When is the exam? 13th of May. What time? 2 to 5. Okay, write that on your hearts. Please don't turn up on the 12th or the 14th. Where is it? In the lecture theatre? In the sports centre? Sports centre. Okay, I will be thinking of you. I will be wishing you well. Looking forward to your excellent answers. And have fun if you can.
我刚回来，我2天前才回来，很爽啊。在家回家有些问问，在家的话天天带孩子。还是你有。哎，怎么？这我都没出。